Well, Hong Kong has been in turmoil for months after protests were sparked by a bill that would have permitted extradition to mainland China. Since then, the protests have transformed into broader anti-government demonstrations. Now, the 5 months of protests are taking a toll on not only the Hong Kong economy, but U.S. President Donald Trump signing into law bills that support Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement is complicating relations between the U.S. and China. And of course, this as the two superpowers have a December 15th deadline to meet. Now, joining me live from Hong Kong via Skype is David Lee, Senior Lecturer of Business and Economics at the University of Hong Kong. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, Jen.
Now, as someone on the ground, would you briefly explain to us the current situation in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think as your reporter mentioned, there's certainly been a lull after the district council elections last week. But clearly this weekend, there have been protests again. Most of the transportation system is generally getting back to normal. But I think more broadly, the idea of continued protest is probably the new normal. It may not be at the larger scale that we saw a few months ago. But clearly, protesters still have a lot of demands they feel like that haven't been met yet. And that will continue to manifest itself in the kind of the protest activity that we'll see. And beyond that, a lot of the universities were closed, including my university. We basically closed early. The semester ended early, and we've been doing alternative means of trying to deliver, education. But, I don't think this is not an end to the protests. It's maybe a slight lull, but certainly protests will continue.
Sure. Now, I want to get into the business and economic aspect of things. How are businesses in Hong Kong being pulled into this? How are these protests in Hong Kong impacting the economic conditions in Hong Kong? For instance, foreign businesses, investment, tourism. I'm sure there are a lot more to that.
Yeah, certainly. So, I think broadly, if you think of it as two big buckets, on one hand, there are obviously businesses that are directly related to people visiting Hong Kong. So these would be like hotels, resident shopping areas, restaurants, things like that. And most of those have been hit considerably. A lot of these businesses are geared towards having, in particular, mainland visitors who come from mainland China. And if you look at a lot of kind of financial reports, accounting that's come out, I would say the last few weeks even, most of those businesses have been hit quite hard. There are even some businesses that have reported, even being down upwards of 90% of revenue year on year. So this compared to this time last year, they're down 90% of revenue. So there are a number of businesses like that. I think in a lot of major tourist and business destinations in Hong Kong, there's been a fair amount of store closures or impending store closures because a lot of places can't meet rents. Rents are obviously fairly high in Hong Kong. So that's one bucket, the businesses that are directly impacted by lack of visitors. But I think more broadly, there has been a backlash against business establishments, particularly those tied to Chinese, mainland Chinese business entities. So this is when you see a lot of kind of vandalization of storefronts and bank fronts. And most of those businesses are tied to either businesses that are directly somehow related to mainland China or, are seen to support kind of mainland China in all of this. And so that's kind of probably the other bucket. And both of those combined have put Hong Kong in a technical recession recently.
Or even technical recession. Now, let's get to the broader things. How do you expect Mr. Trump's latest signing of bills supporting pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong would play out in the U.S.-China trade negotiations? China was riled up by this, and there is a December 15th deadline to meet between U.S. and China.
Yeah, I think one thing to point out is that versions of this bill have been around for years, actually 4 or 5 years. So this bill, this law itself, though it's recently signed into law, has been around. The idea of this bill has been around for years, even probably since Occupy Central, which is about 5 years ago. So the idea of the bill is not new. The context is obviously new because it's happening within the context of large-scale protests in Hong Kong, but as well as kind of a turbulent time in the U.S.-China relationship, driven largely by trade at the moment. I think the other thing to realize and point out is that, being kind of anti-China, I guess, is one of the few issues, at least in U.S. politics, that both Republicans and Democrats are kind of on the same page about, which is reflected in the vote, both in the House vote and the Senate vote for the Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act. And so that's kind of the backdrop. So there's nobody who's going to lose political points for supporting this bill in the U.S., which is why it went through so quickly. Now, to your question specifically about how this will impact U.S.-China trade relations, I'm not actually sure if it will, to be frank. The genesis and the impetus of kind of the U.S. trying to become tough on China trade had nothing to do with Hong Kong protests. And ultimately, from an economic perspective and a business perspective, still really has nothing to do with Hong Kong protests. That said, the protesters here and some supporters in the U.S. who want to link it, obviously will try to use this as a tool to try to link those two issues. But I think if we're just looking at it from a purely business and economic sense, I mean, those two are somewhat unrelated, but the nature of politics these days links them. But again, I think in the long run, this new bill will have minimal effect on the overall kind of result of what happens with U.S.-China trade, and if they end up meeting the December 15th deadline or not, that remains to be seen. But I think clearly, the central government of Beijing, when it comes to these kind of matters, usually takes a hardline approach and to these things and how they respond. So I'm not sure if net-net it would be necessarily beneficial in moving the process along.
Absolutely. So what you're saying is the U.S.-China trade negotiations may not be so affected by this, but the Hong Kong economy, Chinese businesses related to Hong Kong or based in Hong Kong are taking a toll. So we'll have to wait and see how all this plays out in the world economy. David Lee, senior lecturer at the University of Hong Kong, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jim.